Evening. The warm air trembles over the road. The sun sinks toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of crimson. You're alone. Your bicycle sways beneath you, and the forest murmurs something ancient, something unknowable. Everything feels ordinary, until you meet him. At first, he seems like just another traveler on horseback. But why are there no hoofbeats? Why does the horse stretch, its body bending as if obeying some unnatural law? And most of all, why can't you look away from those eyes? A story about an encounter that can never be forgotten. Are you ready to hear it? One of the eeriest and most mysterious events in my life happened not too long ago, just 2 years back, when I traveled to my hometown village for summer break. Since childhood, I had believed that unseen forces existed around us, occasionally manifesting in inexplicable ways in our world, and that not all of them could evoke pleasant feelings. But what I witnessed one summer evening on a deserted road near the village gave me the right to replace the word believe with the more categorical no. And to be honest, it also granted me several sleepless nights and a deep, unexplainable fear of my native forests. Summer in a Yakut village is a special time. While in the city, summer is seen as a season of rest and fun. In the villages, work is in full swing. Haymaking occupies the hearts and minds of the residents, forcing them to rise with the first rays of the sun and spend their days until late evening in the fertile meadows, which in Yakutia are called oases. The northern summer is fleeting, and one must manage to harvest enough hay for the livestock, stack it into haycocks, and transport it to the farmstead. And before you know it, autumn is already breathing down your neck. At the same time, haymaking is also a kind of retreat. If you were born and raised in a village, it is your sacred duty to spend at least a couple of weeks each summer in the oases, inhaling the rich aroma of freshly cut grass, listening to the chirping birds, and enjoying a swim in the crystal-clear waters that are abundant in these meadows. So, after wrapping up my tedious university exams, I didn't think twice before hopping on a bus and heading home. During the first week, we cut hay on a small river island, bravely enduring the relentless attacks of mosquitoes and gnats that swarmed in the humid air. At some point, your skin reaches a state where it stops swelling and itching from the bites. After finishing the work on the island, we moved to one of the oases, located about 10 kilometers from the village. We traveled there in my stepfather's old UAZ, loading all the necessary equipment, scythes, rakes, and pitchforks, onto the trailer. Haymaking in an alas is incomparably easier than on the island, not only because of the relatively fewer insects. The main advantage is that the ground in alases is smoother, with fewer stones and roots that could break a scythe. For someone experienced, the work here might seem effortless. I couldn't quite say the same for myself, but I must admit I breathed a sigh of relief when we left the island. Usually we finished by around 8 in the evening and returned to the village in the same car. But soon I got into the habit of bringing my old bicycle, which I had owned since my school years, on the trailer and riding back home alone, enjoying the cool evening air, the ride, and the sense of a job well done. Besides, the trip took no more than half an hour, far better than bouncing around in the stuffy cabin of the UAZ alongside my not-so-talkative stepfather. That evening was no exception. We had set up several dozen haycocks, which would later need to be gathered into a large stack. When the sun began to noticeably sink toward the west, my stepfather packed up the equipment and left. I think it was around 8:30. I stayed behind in the alas and swam to my heart's content in the small lake in the center of the clearing. My mood was excellent, dampened only by the muddy bottom of the lake, which dirtied my feet. Swimming in the river was much more pleasant. The current created a unique sensation, and the bottom was covered in clean golden sand. After leaving the water, I got dressed and mounted my bicycle. By then, the sun had taken on a deep crimson hue, which usually signaled rain in the summer. I pedaled leisurely, the wheels steadily scattering small stones that lay along the dirt road. On both sides of the road, pine trees dominated the landscape, though occasionally I spotted birches and larches. This was a mixed forest. The dense pines cast long shadows over the road. Combined with the fiery red sun flickering between the trunks, the sight was strikingly beautiful and full of contrast. The fateful encounter happened about 4 kilometers down the road. At that point, the forest on the right side thinned out, revealing another alas enclosed by a wooden fence. Such barriers were used by owners to protect their hay from free-roaming village cows, horses, and other unwelcome intruders. The alas was empty, but in the distance I could see the yellow outlines of haystacks. To the left, a narrow stream flowed, so there were fewer trees in that direction as well. Ahead, a sharp bend in the road prevented me from seeing who or what might be approaching. It was one of those high-risk accident zones that traffic officers always warn about. Yakutia's dirt roads and highways are full of so-called bad places, where people claim supernatural events occur, a gray-haired old woman with a staff chasing after cars, or a young girl hitchhiking by the roadside, only to suddenly vanish from the vehicle without a trace. Every such tale is usually backed by a chilling backstory. Perhaps the old woman was run over by a truck here, or the girl had hanged herself from a branch just 20 meters from where she flagged down a ride. But the road I was on had no such sinister reputation. If anyone had ever witnessed something strange here, the whole village would have whispered about it for the next 100 years. In that sense, I suppose I was lucky. Taking in the sight of the empty alas bathed in the red glow of sunset, I turned my gaze back to the road and saw a rider emerge from around the bend. The horse was bay-colored and moved at a light trot. The rider didn't strike me as unusual. Horses were a common and often more practical mode of transport in Yakutia than cars. I confidently steered my bicycle toward him. Now, thinking back, I can identify the one detail that should have alarmed me. The horse's hooves made no sound as they struck the ground. The animal moved in complete silence, but at the time I didn't notice. The horse looked weary, its head hanging low. The rider sat upright in the saddle, not glancing around. From a distance, I could make out that he was dressed in dark clothing, but again, I thought nothing of it. Bright colors weren't particularly favored in these parts. If anything, I was dressed plainly myself, in a gray t-shirt and brown shorts. And so I rode close enough to finally sense, on some deep, instinctive level, that something was very wrong with this lone rider. My brain had not yet fully processed the input from my senses, but the feeling was undeniable. A few moments later, with horrifying clarity, I recognized the first thing that should have been impossible: his legs. They were monstrously long. So long, in fact, that despite the horse's considerable height, they dragged along the ground. And they didn't end in feet. Instead, they simply grew thinner and thinner until they just vanished. But they were legs. The second thing that made the hairs on my neck stand on end was the horse itself. Until now, I had only seen it from the front and noticed nothing unusual. But as I rode closer and got a side view, another grotesque distortion of proportions became clear. The horse was long as its rider's legs. It still had 4 legs, as far as I could tell, but its back stretched for what seemed like meters. I think it could have outstretched 3 normal horses standing nose to tail. That alone should have been enough to make me pass out from fear. But I had the misfortune of not stopping there. I looked up at the rider's face. The moment I did, my memory blurred. I vaguely recall the painful sensation of falling and the stench of something acrid, like burning rubber, filling my nose. The thing must have simply passed by, paying me no attention. When I came to, I found myself sprawled on the road with my bicycle, my right shin burning, Nothing serious, just scraped skin, as I later found out. And the road, once again, empty. The terrible smell had dissipated, vanished into the air. The sun had shifted slightly in the sky. My blackout hadn't lasted long. Its blood-red glow made me feel nauseous. With a shiver running down my spine, I forced myself to stand and get back on my bike. Riding at a leisurely pace was now out of the question. I pedaled as fast as I could, glancing back every few seconds to make sure the long-legged rider wasn't chasing after me. 15 minutes passed, feeling like an hour, before I finally rode into the village and exhaled in relief. Music blared from stereo speakers in the yards, a chainsaw whined somewhere, and the chatter of children filled the air. All of it was grounding, dispelling the memories that still made my body alternate between heat and cold. I couldn't keep the incident to myself and told my parents. We agreed that the entity was likely what locals called a passing ghost, one that was simply traveling elsewhere on its own business. The region's folklore is filled with stories of similar encounters. Supposedly, such ghosts weren't capable of causing harm, even in theory, but that knowledge did little to calm me. Needless to say, I never rode my bike past the Alas in the evening again. Even stepping outside to use the outhouse at night became a struggle. Over time, the vividness of that encounter began to fade, and I hope I'll eventually manage to suppress the fear it left behind. But there's one thing about the terrifying rider that I will never forget. I never told my parents or friends about it, limiting my story to his unnaturally long legs and distorted horse. It was simply too terrifying to bring back into my mind, too unbearable to describe. The eyes, wide, sharp, like they had been scorched, burning into his face. Even now, when I'm home alone at night, I fear they might still be watching. I'll share another Yakutian horror story. This one is unusual for local folklore, as malevolent spirits, abasi, are not typically depicted as corporeal beings. They are usually vague, appearing as shifting silhouettes in the darkness, their faces obscured, manifesting and vanishing suddenly, like shadows that the eye struggles to focus on. However, this story is widely recounted around campfires, and some local writers have even used it as inspiration for their works. This tale is about two brothers. The elder was around 30, the younger 5 years his junior. Both were experienced hunters and set out in early autumn for a prolonged expedition into the deepest wilderness, where game remained undisturbed by human presence. This was not their first long hunting trip, and they were well accustomed to such journeys. The forest was as familiar to them as their own home. They established a camp near an unnamed river, quickly constructing a temporary hut, lighting a fire, and, adhering to ancient traditions, offering food and spirits to the fire spirit, and through it, to all the unseen entities that roamed the land, hoping to earn their favor. Then they began their hunt. The forest was abundant with game, and within a few days they had gathered an impressive haul, already envisioning the wealth it would bring once sold. On the 4th or 5th day, the first snow fell. That evening, the brothers sat in their hut after a long day, enjoying a warm meal, immersed in idle conversation. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows against the wooden walls. Then, suddenly, they heard footsteps outside in the fresh snow. Instinctively, they reached for their rifles. Perhaps a bear. But no, the steps were unmistakably human. The sound drew closer to the door, and then a woman's voice rang out, "Oh, the cold is unbearable." The brothers froze. The door creaked open, revealing a young woman standing in the threshold. She was beautiful, dressed in fine yet curiously old-fashioned winter garments, out of place for Soviet times, but practical enough for the wilderness. She greeted them warmly and explained that she was the daughter of a villager from a nearby settlement. She had wandered too far into the forest, lost her way, and had been roaming for hours. Just when despair took hold, she spotted the glow of their fire and followed it. The brothers exchanged uneasy glances. They knew this area well. There was no village within 300 kilometers. But the woman was visibly trembling from the cold, her breath uneven. She was undeniably real. Suppressing their doubts, they invited her in, offered her a seat at the table, and poured her a steaming cup of tea. She accepted with gratitude, speaking of her terror, her exhaustion, and her profound relief at finding them. The elder brother nodded along, reassured by her demeanor, but the younger, more reserved and perceptive by nature, watched her with growing unease. After some time, he excused himself and stepped outside under the pretense of checking their equipment. By now, twilight had thickened, but the snow provided some visibility. He crouched to examine her footprints. They led toward the riverbank and abruptly ended. The river had not yet frozen. If she had crossed it, her clothing should have been drenched. A cold dread settled in his stomach. His thoughts turned to the ancient legends whispered among hunters, tales of powerful, malevolent entities dwelling in the deepest, most untouched recesses of the wilderness, beings far older and more insidious than the Abasi. Deciding to proceed cautiously, he resolved to warn his brother subtly. Upon re-entering the hut, he found the atmosphere had shifted. A bottle had been opened, and the elder brother was engrossed in conversation with the woman, his gaze locked onto hers with a fervor beyond mere curiosity. Her responses were smooth, engaging, almost hypnotic. The younger brother attempted to interrupt, suggesting they check on their gear before it was buried under snow. His brother shot him a sharp glare, silent but firm. Meanwhile, for the briefest moment, the woman turned her gaze upon him, and in that instant he saw something inhuman beneath her expression, something cold, predatory, utterly devoid of warmth. His pulse quickened. He withdrew to his corner, feigning indifference, his fingers tightening around the stock of his rifle beneath his blanket. Hours passed, and as the fire dimmed, the couple retreated behind a makeshift screen. He lay still, listening, his nerves taut as he resisted the heavy pull of sleep. At some point, exhaustion overtook him. But his rest was not peaceful. He awoke to a sound, a slow, deliberate scraping. The fire had nearly died, the embers casting only faint, flickering light. The noise emanated from the corner where his brother and the woman lay. A low, rasping moan followed each scrape. His breath hitched. He seized his rifle and moved forward, yanking the screen aside. In the dim light, he saw a monstrous figure crouched over his brother. Not the woman, but something else entirely. Its limbs were twisted, its body hunched, its face obscured by darkness except for two enormous, burning yellow eyes. It was gnawing at his brother's throat, the grisly sound of teeth grinding against vertebrae filling the air. His brother's body trembled weakly, a strangled whimper escaping his lips. For a moment, sheer terror threatened to paralyze him. Then instinct surged through his veins. He raised his rifle and fired point-blank into the creature's face. A shriek erupted, inhuman, piercing. The thing recoiled, leaping from his brother and darting toward the door. Some say it hissed, "I should have killed you first," before vanishing into the night. He fired again, but it was already gone. Trembling, he stoked the fire, desperately bringing light into the room. Then he turned to his brother. But he was too late. The elder's eyes had rolled back, his throat torn open, his body unnaturally still. The bedding was soaked in blood. Strangely, despite the carnage, there was no blood trail leading outside. Even in the untouched snow, he found no trace of the creature's passage. At dawn, he fled to the nearest settlement, returning later with a group of men to retrieve his brother's remains and dismantle the hut. Since then, the river has been called Abasi Uraj, the river of evil spirits. No hunter dares linger near its banks. One man from our village, also a hunter, claimed he had camped by that river in the Aldan region once, and nothing happened. Perhaps he was lying. Hello, dear listener. If you want to support me, subscribe to my channel, hit the bell, and leave a like. It motivates me to keep making new episodes for you, and with that, we're not saying goodbye. See you in the next episode.